Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Alaska's first ranked choice voting election. I am Steve Huffner and I am the Deputy Director of the Election Law Program here at The Ohio State University. As many of you participating know, this is the second time this year that the OSU Election Law Program has hosted a conversation about Alaska's new electoral system, a system that uses a single nonpartisan open primary from which the top 4 finishers advance to the general election. We first explored the potential implications of this system last April, well before Alaska conducted the primary for its special election to fill its vacant congressional seat. We are convening today to revisit the operation of Alaska's new electoral system now that that special election to fill this open seat has concluded. And we are pleased to have back 3 of the guests who participated in that earlier event, plus a new expert, each of whom I will introduce shortly. But first, let me share my screen to use a few slides to summarize briefly Alaska's top 4 process as it was used in the election for Alaska's lone congressional seat. This was an election to fill the seat that had been occupied by Don Young since 1973 until his death last March. And the process required that Alaska conduct a special election to fill the unexpired portion of his term through this coming January. And under Alaska law, that meant that there would be a primary election on June 11th. This was a nonpartisan open primary at which the voters each were allowed to just pick one candidate. And then the top 4 candidates emerging from that primary advanced to a special general election using ranked choice voting that occurred on August 16th. Now it's worth just observing that on that same day, August 16th, Alaska was then also conducting the primary election for the regular 2-year term in Congress to commence in January 2023 for Alaska's 1 congressional seat. And the general election for that regular 2-year term in Congress will be held on November 8th using the same process where 4 candidates advance from the August 16th primary and then a ranked choice system is used on the general election date. But returning to the special election that's now concluded. So at the June 11th primary, these were the 48 candidates and their party affiliations, and then top 4 moved on to the general. Those top 4 were, in order, Sarah Palin, Nick Begich, Al Gross, and Mary Peltola. After the special primary election was concluded, Al Gross dropped out, and he urged his supporters to cast their votes for Mary Peltola. That then moves us to the August 16th general election, and the ballot at that general election looks like this. After Al Gross dropped out, Nick Begich, Sarah Palin, and Mary Peltola are listed on the ballot. There's also room for a write-in, and then voters are each allowed to pick, or to express really, up to 4 choices and rank order their preferences for those candidates. After the August 16th election was concluded, the first round results looked like this, with Mary Peltola having received just over 40% of the vote, Sarah Palin just over 31% of the vote, and Nick Begich 28.5% of the vote. At that point, the ranked choice process eliminates the candidate with the least first place votes, which is Nick Begich, and it then takes the second choice votes of voters who had picked Begich first. And of those voters whose first choice was Begich, 50% of those voters had picked Sarah Palin second, so those votes are redistributed to Sarah Palin. And 29% had put Peltola second, so those votes are reassigned to Mary Peltola. And 21% had put no second choice or had indicated a write-in candidate. As you can see then from what were the final results, after excluding the 21% of the Begich voters who did not express a preference between Peltola and Palin, Peltola emerged as the majority vote getter and the winner of the special election to fill the unexpired term of Don Young. Now, just to complete sort of where we stand, on August 16th, we also saw Alaska conduct a primary election for the regular 2-year term. The results of that primary election were, not surprisingly, very close to the results for the special election, with Mary Peltola in first position, followed by Sarah Palin and Nick Begich, and then coming in fourth was Tara Sweeney. Tara Sweeney has since dropped out. So when we get to the general election in November, we will see Chris Bai also on the ballot. Those will be the 4 candidates in the ranked choice general election in November. So that is an attempt to just make clear the process that Alaska has used for the special election that's concluded and that they will be using going forward for the general election for the regular seat. And so let me now introduce our 4 panelists. As I introduce each one, I'm going to invite each to offer some initial thoughts about the just concluded special election before we then open things up for discussion. So first, we're going to invite James Brooks to spend a few minutes with us. We're happy to once again have James with us. James, who is currently a reporter for the Alaska Beacon, is a longtime Alaska reporter of almost 15 years, having previously worked at the Anchorage Daily News, the Juneau Empire, the Kodiak Mirror, and the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. He is based in Juneau, where he covers state government, the Alaska legislature, and other capital city assignments. And he's a double major in English and history. James, to get us started, I'd like to ask you to just talk about how the campaign for the special election for this House seat played out on the ground there in Alaska, particularly with voters and their experience in preparing for this type of election and the way the candidates approached it as well. So what did you observe?
Thanks for the question. And at first, once you leave that primary election, that top 4 primary, we had the situation with Al Gross. It's still not clear why he dropped out, but that created a bit of confusion and some debate as to whether he could be replaced. The statute, as part of the ballot measure that installed ranked choice voting, sets a deadline by which a candidate who drops out can be replaced. Al Gross withdrew after that deadline because of the short timeline involved with the special election, so he could not be replaced. That left the race with 3 candidates. And in the election for the special ranked choice vote, we saw that Palin and Begich were very aggressive towards each other, while Peltola took a more conciliatory approach and stayed out of the fray, above the fray. Palin urged her supporters to rank only one person. Begich took a more party line approach, and the party's position was to rank the red, to put either Palin or Begich as number 1 and the other as number 2. The Republican Party ran a campaign urging folks to rank the red, but Palin undermined that, and during his visit to Alaska, former President Donald Trump did the same, urging people to rank only one. He also repeated that during a teleconferenced campaign event with Palin later on, telling people to rank only one. And that shows up in the results that later on, that 40% of Palin's supporters, people who ranked Palin first, picked only one candidate. And then what we saw in the results that you just broke down for us was that a large number of Begich voters who picked Begich first, picked Peltola second, or picked no one at all. It was about 50-50. 50% picked Palin, 50% picked either Peltola or no one at all. And so what happened there? Why was that? Well, Palin would argue that the system was complicated, people were confused and didn't understand that. The numbers that I've seen indicate otherwise. There were very few overvotes, votes that were counted for no candidate at all. What we see are a large number of votes that were counted for at least one candidate. And many people either didn't find a second candidate that they liked or simply wanted to vote for one candidate. I'm not sure what the breakdown is on that, but the polling, pre-election polling, seems to indicate that Palin's unpopularity rating was extremely high in this election, that 60% of Alaskans have an unfavorable view of Sarah Palin and are unlikely to vote for her under any conditions. And that proportion is even higher for Nick Begich supporters, that 70% have a negative view of Sarah Palin. And that seems to indicate why the results were what they were, that Begich voters were more willing to vote for a Democrat than Sarah Palin, or were more willing to vote for no one at all than Sarah Palin. And that seemed to be clear to me as I talked to voters on election day and beforehand, attending the rally held by former President Donald Trump in Anchorage. It was clear that voters, Republican voters especially, did not support ranked choice voting and so wanted to vote for only one candidate, and in many cases did so. And that ended up contributing to the results that we saw.
Thank you, James. There's plenty more we can continue to think about, and we'll have some questions about a little later. But let me now turn to Benjamin Reilly. We're delighted to welcome Ben. He's a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Western Australia, and he was formerly the dean of the Sir Walter Murdoch School and director of the Centre for Democratic Institutions at the Australian National University, where he earned his PhD in political science. He has worked with the Australian government, with the United Nations, other international organizations, and held visiting appointments here in the US at Harvard and Johns Hopkins, as well as at Oxford University. He's a senior fellow of the East-West Center in Honolulu today, and over the past year he has made several research visits to Alaska, interviewing candidates and electoral officials and providing comparative advice on the administration of ranked choice voting systems and being an observer of things happening there. So Ben, could we ask you to focus your initial thoughts on the role that political parties played in Alaska's special election, and perhaps also the role that political parties played generally in ranked choice voting elections? And this will obviously allow you to build on some of the observations that James just shared. So thank you, Ben.
Sure. Thanks very much, Steve. And hello, everyone. Really good to be here. Yeah. So I've been studying ranked choice voting around the world. I'm an Australian. We've used ranked choice voting for over 100 years in Australia, but it's been a research agenda of mine since my PhD. So I've been really, it's been great having the opportunity to look at this system as it spreads in the United States. I did some work in Maine a couple of years ago, which was, of course, the first statewide adoption, and now in Alaska. So in terms of your question about political parties, elsewhere, in other jurisdictions, parties have adapted to ranked choice voting fairly easily. Indeed, in Australia, it's often thought to kind of help the two big parties. We have a two-party system, but we also have some minor parties, because voters who choose a smaller party will normally give one of their later rankings to one or the other of the bigger parties, and normally that will flow through to them as the smaller parties are eliminated, just in the same way as the process you just showed on your slides. But because of the interaction of ranked choice voting with a top four system, and that's really, it's that interaction between the top four open primary and ranked choice voting in Alaska, which makes the Alaska system unique. The top four primary was critiqued, continues to be critiqued, as essentially weakening parties. And there's two arguments there. One is that because there's no single nominee, as you showed, there were many party individuals standing for, you had many for the Republican Party, quite a few for the Democrats, and even for third parties like the Alaska Independence parties in that very large open primary of 48 candidates. But even in more regular open primaries, I think we, the state legislature open primaries, which were also conducted last month in August, we would typically have seen more than one Republican, given the Republicans are the dominant party in Alaska, standing. So there's an argument that undermines the party's ability to control their nominee. And then there's a second argument that is a little bit more focused on ranked choice voting, and James just touched on it with the Sarah Palin case, which is that if a party chooses, as part of their strategy, as part of their business model, to put forward highly polarizing candidates who have a strong base of support, but sort of repel as many other people, rather than having a broad-based kind of support, then that could, in theory, lessen the ability of parties to offer very clear distinctions to voters and, in turn, in government. So there are theories around saying that this system, it creates difficulties for parties. My own sense, and the sense of my co-authors as well, we've got a research project looking at all of these elections in Alaska, is that at least so far, I don't think parties have really been undermined. And indeed, there's an argument that I think some of you would be familiar with. I think Lee Drutman and others have made this argument that America really has, at least a four-party system, maybe more. In other words, there are traditional Republicans, there are MAGA Republicans, there are centrist Democrats, there are progressive Democrats, that are being kind of like forced into this artificial two-party system. And of course, there are other parties like the Greens and the Libertarians. And actually what the top four open primary plus RCV allowed was for, at least to some extent, that reality of a four-party system to be expressed. So not just in the House special election, but in the other statewide primaries for the US House seat, for the US Senate seat, for the governor. I think we can see in each of those, there's at least a moderate and a more hardline Republican candidate that will go through in the top four. There's at least one progressive candidate. In some cases, there's two progressive candidates. In fact, if Al Gross hadn't dropped out, we would have had essentially two candidates probably on the more centre left sort of side, and two candidates clearly on the right in the special election. So to my mind, that actually is an example of the system succeeding. Lots of diversity in terms of candidate offerings. It's pretty inescapable that the contrast with how things would have played out under a more traditional primary system, the same primary system that exists in most of the country, that exists in Ohio, where, in all likelihood, Sarah Palin would have been the one Republican candidate put forward, and we probably would have had a different election outcome. I think the other thing I would say quickly, I'm conscious of time, is that James, I think was right in that the second rankings from Begich supporters really ended up determining the election outcome. And I was struck by the fact that if Palin had got as many number two rankings from Begich supporters as Begich got from Palin supporters proportionately, he got, by my count, 57%. We might have had a different outcome. So she didn't, she didn't get enough second preferences for the reasons that James explained. She's a polarizing candidate. And under ranked choice voting, if you don't attract many second preferences, then you're always vulnerable. We've seen this in Maine and some of the outcomes there, that candidates, again, on the Republican side, who deliberately didn't campaign for second rankings, lost out in close elections. But I think this is something that the Republicans can and probably will learn from in Alaska. And if they can get at the House election in November, better coordination between their two candidates, then they actually still have a very good chance of winning the seat, because you're still talking about something like a 60% party vote for Republicans. Of course, now Mary Peltola's in office with incumbency and all the advantages that creates. Things could change there too. But I don't think this system disadvantages Republicans in the way that people like President Trump and Palin have claimed. In fact, if they work the system properly, it will probably work to the advantage of Republicans. But to do that, they have to campaign differently, not attack each other so much. And as James said, I think that was really the key problem for them. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Ben. Let me just make one quick observation on something you said, and then we'll extend the discussion with Lisa Manheim next. But you observed that in a ranked choice system, if you don't attract many second choice votes, you're always vulnerable. And I just want to say that's only true if you haven't attracted a majority of first choice votes, right? And I think it's worth keeping in mind that ranked choice operates in an environment in which if you obtain a majority of first place votes, that's the end of it. The question is how to get to a majority is what we're thinking about. So.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And indeed, of course, if Peltola had won a majority of first choice votes, then there wouldn't have even, that's it, the election's over. So that's quite right. But the issue is you never know in advance. In a really safe seat, you do. But in a close race like this, the candidates never know in advance. And so it should be, if they're rational, it should be in their interest to try and at least attract a few. And I don't think, I think that was really a weakness in Palin's strategy.
So we'll turn now to Lisa Marshall Manheim, whom we are also very grateful to have returning to our program today. Lisa is the Charles I. Stone Professor of Law at the University of Washington. She writes in the areas of constitutional law, election law, and presidential powers. And she earned her JD from Yale Law School, practiced law for several years before joining the University of Washington faculty, clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, as well as for Justice Kennedy on the U.S. Supreme Court. Lisa, how about if you offer a few initial critiques of ranked choice voting and some arguable limitations of it, perhaps responding a little to what Ben had said and anything else you have for us.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me to come and join the conversation today. So as Steve suggested, my role here today is to serve as a bit of a devil's advocate. So I'm going to now articulate a bunch of criticisms of systems like Alaska's. And just to be clear, I don't necessarily agree with all these criticisms, but I do think that they're important. And in part, they're important because they go to the merits of a system like Alaska's. And in part, they're important because, these systems, they need buy-in. They need to be implemented. They need to not be repealed. There needs to be legitimacy surrounding them. So whether these criticisms ultimately are right or wrong, they do need to be dealt with. They do need to be responded to. So I would say that the criticisms of ranked choice voting can be grouped, many of them can be grouped into three broad categories. The first category of criticisms, in a sense, is concerns that voters can't handle ranked choice voting. The second broad category of criticisms you might think of as ranked choice voting maybe does not produce the outcomes that are appropriate. And then the third broad category is basically looks beyond ranked choice voting to say, whether or not ranked choice voting has some advantages, we should be focusing reform efforts elsewhere. So I've been thinking of them as concerns over voter problems, concerns over outcome problems, and then concerns over prioritization problems. And what I'll do is I'll just give a few examples that help to illustrate each category. So first, in terms of voter problems. The idea here, in a sense, is that a ranked choice voting system very well may be great in theory, particularly if the electorate consisted of a bunch of experts in voting systems. But in terms of your average voter, that person is likely to not have the time or the expertise or the capacity or the inclination to figure this system out. Now, these concerns come in many different forms, and this is where we'll hear people talk about things like problems with voter confusion, problems with ballot exhaustion, problems with the threat of misinformation, and so on. To give one example, so ballot exhaustion refers to a voter's decision, for whatever reason, not to fill out an entire ballot. Maybe the voter doesn't have the time or the inclination to fill it out. Maybe the voter is confused. And as a result of not filling out the entire ranked choice voting ballot, their ballot is effectively ignored in the final round of tallying. And so what this can produce, among other things, is a situation where the winner of a ranked choice voting election does not actually have a majority of all ballots cast. Instead, that winner has a majority only of the ballots that are counted in that final round of tallying. And so this is what we had in Alaska. And so this is just one example of the sort of many different concerns that arise in this first general category of what I'm thinking of as voter problems. And again, the idea here for this first category is that even if ranked choice voting might be a great system for a bunch of people with unlimited time and interest and cognitive capacity, maybe it's not a good system for the electorate that we actually have. The second broad category of criticisms you might think of as being criticisms of the outcomes that ranked choice voting produces. And these criticisms often look to the promises of ranked choice voting and then compares those promises against what the outcomes that we actually see. And so, consistent with Arrow's theorem, what we do, you do have scenarios with respect to ranked choice voting where the outcomes don't quite fit the promises. We've already discussed one just a second ago. So ranked choice voting is supposed to ensure that the candidate with the broadest, the most votes and the broadest support wins. But if you have, for example, too much ballot exhaustion, then you can have a candidate win, even though that candidate, in a sense, has much more marginal support than one might think the candidate would have in order to make it through the system here. There are also other scenarios that we can imagine where the outcomes don't quite fit the promises. And actually the questions that have come in with the Q&A so far, a lot of those questions go to those same concerns. They're asking things like 60% of voters in Alaska ranked a Republican candidate in their first choice, for their first choice, how could a Democrat have won? Or they say, in a counterfactual world where Nick Begich gets is able to beat Sarah Palin, then based on the votes we have, it seems likely that he would have then also beat Mary Peltola. So how can it be the case that Mary Peltola is the one now headed to Congress? This is ranked choice voting in action, and reasonable minds can and do disagree as to whether this sort of outcome we're describing really does represent the winning candidate having the most votes and the broadest support. In a sense, Peltola did have that, but in a sense, she did not. Reasonable minds can disagree. Another set of concerns relating to sort of outcomes generally are more sophisticated because they look sort of 1 degree removed, and they start asking, what does this system do to the political parties? What does this system do to the sort of the ability of a legislature formed through ranked choice voting? What does it do to that legislature's ability to govern going forward? These are very important sort of concerns that people have, and I'm just going to flag them because they're very sort of complicated. And Ben alluded to some of those in his discussion. And then finally, okay, so I talked a bit about the voter concerns. I talked a bit about the outcome concerns. And then the final category is what I've been referring to as prioritization concerns. And there, the sort of the thrust of the argument is, look, ranked choice voting, it may be good, it may be bad, but what's better, what we really should be focused on here is this other alternative system. And so this is where you have people saying, let's talk about approval voting, or let's talk about score voting, or let's talk about fusion voting. Or maybe they say, let's talk about strengthening the political parties. Let's just do this, with the system we have. And so, I want to make sure that I open up the conversation to questions and to my fellow panelists. So again, what I'm trying to do here is just articulate some of the many criticisms that have been and now are being lodged toward a system like Alaska's.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So finally, we're happy to welcome back Michael Parsons. Mike is a senior legal fellow at Fair Vote, a nonpartisan organization with a 30-year history of seeking to promote better election processes and voting reforms that make democracy more functional. At Fair Vote, Michael provides policy guidance and legal advice in connection with both state and federal legislation and election litigation. He's a program affiliate scholar at the NYU School of Law, and he's also a practicing lawyer who advises nonprofits and government officials and candidates regarding voting rights and election law. He received his law degree from Georgetown University and clerked for both the Federal District Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. Mike, let me ask you both to respond to some of these critiques of ranked choice voting, and also to share briefly some initial reaction to Alaska's use of the ranked choice voting in this special election.
Sure, thanks, Steve. So first, really happy to be here, and I have been assigned the role of RCV defender, which will be easy because I am, in fact, an enthusiastic supporter of RCV. So a few things just to kind of set the table. I think Mary Peltola built on a strong first round lead to go on to win. She led in the first round by 9 points. It's, highly come from behind wins are fairly rare in ranked choice voting. So in our experience, only about 4% of RCV elections result in a come from behind winner. And the largest there's ever been is about 10% based on the data we have from US elections. And so, 9% behind in the first round matches expectations to not really make that up. And we also saw that baggage voters, as discussed, split heavily in their second choices, with only half going to Palin and 28% crossing party lines to vote for Mary Peltola. And then again, 20% not choosing to rank at all. And as has been discussed, RCV does produce certain incentives. It rewards candidates to reach out to potential second choices. And so, there is evidence from New York, from Maine, and I think now from Alaska, that voters really do follow candidate cues. So if a candidate is saying, don't make use of the ranked choice system, only rank one, we shouldn't be surprised when voters start following those cues. And oftentimes it's only going to backfire, right? So if there had been more baggage first voters who did follow rank the red guidance, it's quite possible that Palin could have prevailed. And it's still quite possible that Palin could prevail in the general election in November, depending on how the dynamics change. If you're a Republican candidate who says that you yourself are not going to rank the red and you yourself are not going to rank baggage second on your own ballot, you shouldn't really be surprised when baggage voters don't, go ahead and do the same and only rank one candidate. I do want to flag here that as Professor Manheim has indicated, there's different ways of sort of conceptualizing majority winners and alternative systems. But I do want to flag here that RCV ensured that a candidate with majority support won, and it ensured, almost more importantly, that a candidate opposed by a majority lost. Palin loses against either candidate, and she lost under the system. She has pretty high negatives, an approval rating roughly in the 30s, and so at the end of the day, again, nearly 30% of baggage supporters preferred Peltola over Palin. We also saw really high turnout. This is the third highest Alaska primary turnout of all time. And we saw a heavy support. So 85% of Alaska voters found RCV simple to use, going to, again, some of the objections that, is RCV too complicated? Is it complex? 85% of Alaska voters found RCV simple. 73% ranked at least two candidates. This is similar with some other high numbers we've seen after the 2021 New York City primary. 95% of voters found RCV simple to use. 77% of voters supported using RCV for future local elections. So voters who use RCV like RCV, they see its benefits. They see the ability to have more choice, to have more influence, to have a greater chance that their vote counts towards a winning candidate. And so I think that all of this kind of goes to this question of, is it too complex? Can voters really make use of it? We often find people saying that voters won't be able to understand it, but I rarely find a voter who says, I won't be able to understand it, right? It's normally sort of an objection about some other voters who won't be able to handle it. So again, I think the numbers from the surveys we've seen are that there's high ranking usage and the voters do understand and like the system. And of course, that ranking usage depends on a lot of factors, some of which is how candidates use the system. So again, Nick Begich voters tended to use rankings more often. 80% of Begich voters selected a second choice, compared with much lower numbers for Palin voters. And I think a lot of this, goes to some of these other issues as well. So if we're looking at voter error, I think actually someone in the comments noted this, in terms of overvotes, that was only 0.2%. So in terms of actual voter error, it's a fairly low number. And in terms of exhausted ballots, I see I'm already past 5 minutes, so happy to respond to more of this in the questions. But on exhausted ballots, I think there's a question. Oftentimes, people need to maybe sort of check their priors as they come in on this. A lot of analysts, commentators will say, look, this person only ranked one. That's an irrational voter. Why wouldn't you use additional rankings? But voters make up their own decisions. In American RCV systems, we don't require voters to rank all candidates. And survey data out of Alaska shows that 75% of voters who only ranked one because it was the only candidate they liked. They didn't want, say, a Begich voter didn't want their ballot to go to Palin. They didn't want their ballot to go to Peltola. They'd just rather vote for Begich and go home, right? And so the counterfactual here is, if you had, say, a runoff, or if this was a general election between Peltola and Palin, would those voters have showed up at all, right? Maybe not. They might have just stayed home. So this at least offered them a chance to have a voice, have influence on the process. Happy to dig into some of the other questions in the Q&A, especially around, say, the head-to-head matchups point.
Terrific. Thanks, Mike. Well, let me tie a couple things together quickly, and in fact, maybe think about the head-to-head question for just a minute. But first, by appreciating the point you made that voters may vote differently when they understand the system, or when they use a different system may vote differently. So it's a little hard to know exactly what would have happened. But there are some questions that Lisa was making some reference to in the Q&A about how this might have played out in a different structure. And in particular, you can think about a traditional primary, which Ben made reference to earlier, in which maybe we would have seen Begich and Peltola go head-to-head in a Republican primary. And if Peltola wins that Republican primary, it's not at all clear that, if Begich and Palin went head-to-head in a Republican primary, and if Palin were to win that Republican primary and then go against Peltola in a traditional general election, the results of this ranked choice election suggest that Peltola might have won that regular general election if that were the choice the voters were presented with. And so that's a partial response to people who say, how can it be that 60% of the first round votes went to Republicans and yet a Democrat won? And so we've already unpacked why that is to a degree, but I wanted to put it up in terms of the alternative way in which the election could have been conducted. But you've also invited us to think about the fact that what we saw here was that a candidate opposed by a majority of the voters lost and couldn't win this race. And it is worth just thinking about what this might have looked like as a head-to-head contest. And I'm going to come right back to you now to just sort of invite your reflections on the fact that this particular ranked choice election did not produce what the political scientists call the Condorcet winner, the winner who would beat all other candidates in sequential head-to-head matchups.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this. I did want to flag, based on your comments, a couple things. I mean, one, as you were saying, a lot of people have been saying, how is it possible that 60% of votes went to Republicans, but a Democrat won? And I do think, as you were indicating, right, if a lot of Republicans would not have showed up were at Palin in a general, or a lot of Republicans would have voted for the Democrat, as the CAP vote records allow us to actually see, right? It's almost a little bit of a false equivalency to say, 60% of Republicans wanted a Republican candidate no matter what, because it's not sort of what the data reflect that we've actually seen. In terms of the head-to-head matchups, looking at the cast vote record, as you indicated, does show that Begich would have prevailed in a head-to-head over Palin, 61 to 39%, and would have prevailed in a head-to-head matchup over Mary Peltola, 53 to 47%. So these are sort of, I do want to stress the point you made, which is voters, candidates campaign, parties make decisions, and voters vote in the system based on the system they're going to have, right? So it's a little bit of a hypothetical rejiggering of the results to say, here's what would have happened, say, if we used a Condorcet system, right? To win in an RCV election, a candidate needs both broad support among backup choices, but also needs deep support among first choices. So a candidate can't win without a strong base of first choice support and can't spring from, last place to first place, even if they have a ton of second choice support. In fact, it's interesting, it's often a common and false accusation among opponents of RCV that it'll lead to candidates, winning that nobody actively really likes, or could lead to candidates, avoiding taking stances on tough issues because, they don't want to rustle anyone's feathers and they just want second choices. But you can't win in an RCV election off of just second choices, right? And I think this highlights an important point, which, getting back to Kenneth Arrow, no election system is perfect. Every system involves trade-offs between desirable goals. And so, to me, the relevant question is, what system is most likely to produce the most representative outcomes among the broadest electorate voting under real world conditions? And to me, the answer is RCV. And I say that for a few reasons. There's a bunch of different kinds of formal Condorcet systems. Condorcet, again, just really focusing on head-to-head matchups. And if there's a Condorcet winner, the person who would win every head-to-head matchup, the system should elect that candidate. I think the first concern I have is that none of those systems actually can guarantee a sincere Condorcet winner under real world conditions. So it's not clear whether this kind of Condorcet failure would happen more or less often than RCV, but these systems currently are used in public elections anywhere in the world. I'm
gonna just move us ahead. If you don't mind. Yep. This is great. James, I know you've been waiting to say something, so let me turn back to you.
Yes, I just wanted to point out another wrinkle in this conversation, which is that under the old law, the pre-existing law as it was before this ranked choice ballot measure became law, the parties would have nominated the candidates in a special election. There would not have been a primary. And so under that scenario, it seems likely that Begich would have been the Republican candidate. He had been registered to run against Don Young, and after Young's death, picked up the Republican Party's nomination and had the support of many party delegates, most party delegates, in fact. And on the Democratic side, it probably would not have been Mary Peltola, the preferred candidate among Democratic Party officials, at least at the start of the race, seemed to be Anchorage Assemblyman Christopher Constant. And so it's possible that if you're looking at head-to-heads for a special election, you'd have a wholly different mix. And so the top four primary matters a whole lot in that conversation.
Very nice. Thank you for that, James. And that brings us back a little bit more to the the question of the role of the political parties here, and I had wanted to ask you, James, maybe it's a little broader question than that too, but what you see happening on the ground there as we now move towards the general election for the 2-year term, and what role the parties are playing. You alluded to this earlier, but what do you see actually happening now?
I think it's worthwhile to look at the legislative races and what's happening in there, because you have 59 different elections with candidates operating in different ways. We just had the withdrawal deadline pass for the general election. 11 candidates dropped out. In many cases, not all, it was because people who performed poorly in the primary wanted to withdraw and throw their support behind another candidate to avoid the chance that discarded votes, exhausted ballots, overvotes would sway the result and throw it to a candidate that they disapprove of. They wanted to avoid the uncertainty of ranked choice voting and put it back to a head-to-head system. And to go back to the party discussion, the top 4 primary, I think, matters a whole lot more than ranked choice voting when you talk about the strength of parties, because no longer does the party determine one specific candidate going forward into the general election.
Thanks, James. Ben, I was hoping I could return to you to invite you, from your standpoint as a political scientist and a careful observer of electoral systems and of Alaska, to maybe sort of take up Lisa's question about prioritization among potential alternative systems, and also I suppose this is reflecting on Mike's belief that nothing is a perfect system and that ranked choice is better than the alternatives. I'm just curious where you come out on that, Ben.
Well, I mean, there of course are other alternatives we haven't discussed. I mean, the big one is proportional representation, which is used very widely around the world. And, there is a ranked choice version of proportional representation. I don't think that's really on the cards in Alaska. It's certainly part of the national discussion. Look, I think it's true that there are other systems that could be imagined, but this is the system that we've got. And as an Australian, I find sometimes, I heard Sarah Palin saying this is a whack-a-mammy system that, never been thought of, dreamt up out of, all these sort of crazy things. It's quite a widely used system around the world. It's not particularly unusual. If you go to other countries like, Ireland or Australia, they've been using it forever. Some of my students find it extraordinary when I tell them that in the United States, they don't get to have rankings in most places. They're like, what? That's how strange. So this is not an unusual system. It's not a weird system. And as Lisa and others have said, actually, when people use it, most voters find it quite intuitive to use. It does create some challenges for electoral administrators. But the big change, as James said, is the top 4 primary, and that what that has done to political parties. And I think that's more, it's the interaction of ranked choice voting with the top 4 system that it really is a significant thing that come out of Alaska. My own sense is that, so far it's worked pretty well. Voters have got more choice. As I said, the sort of real party system that is, at least 2 kinds of Republicans, for example, is on display in nearly all of the major races. And voters get to actually choose which one they like. So, in that sense, to me, the system has succeeded. The one issue we've been talking about with this, we've only had one ranked choice election so far, the special. Again, we know, just coming back to that voting theory discussion really briefly, essentially ranked choice voting won't always elect the Condorcet winner, and it probably didn't in this case. It can never elect the Condorcet loser, who is Palin. And that talks to the much more general point, and why I think the Alaska system might be relevant elsewhere in the United States, which is that it's a really useful system if your problem is polarization, because a highly polarizing candidate struggles to get elected under ranked choice voting. And so, given the situation facing, many parts of the country today, I think this combination of top 4, where you actually get a representative candidates going forward, plus ranked choice voting, might actually have some real appeal, not just in Alaska, but maybe in other places as well.
Thanks, Ben. That's really important. We've had a number of questions in the Q&A about the sort of interaction between the ranked choice system and the top 4, including a question about where else that kind of combination has been in use, and what do we know about where else that kind of 2-staged combination has been used?
It's not in use anywhere else in the world.
Now, another question that I'd like to invite any one of you to respond to briefly from the Q&A is just whether there is a need to, in some sense, restore voter confidence. I mean, the question is, how do you revive voter confidence in ranked choice voting for Alaskans who now distrust the process. And I don't actually know what the proportion of Alaskans who now distrust the process is, but I'm curious what people think about, going forward, whether there is, or to what extent there is a need to help people be more trusting. I don't know whether that's a James question or a Ben question or anybody else.
I'll just say that right now, based on what I've heard from legislative candidates, that there's a high likelihood that it gets repealed in the next legislative session unless there is a change in attitudes.
Is there some meaningful way to change those attitudes? Should there be? I mean, that's not a fair question for you, James. That's more than,
Let me
Mike
just,
or Lisa.
let me just jump in here, Steve. To the extent that the Republicans feel that this disadvantages them, and quite a few of them have said, senior Republican officials have said they'll repeal it. But we need to remember that the new state legislature will be elected under this system, and legislators don't tend to like throwing out they like to dance with the one that brung them, as the saying goes. So, I think we need to really look at this question maybe after November, when there will be quite a few state legislators who will probably owe their position to the new system. I mean, we'll see, but that's I think a reasonable hypothesis. And as I've said, if the Republicans use this system well, this actually should advantage them. They haven't used it well in this special election, and they didn't choose the kind of candidate. The kind of candidates that got put forward, or one of them, was precisely the kind of candidate that tends not to do well under ranked choice voting, which is a polarizing candidate.
And actually, just to
go
ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, to follow on that. I mean, I do think, one, to Professor Reilly's point, once we have a new legislator seated through this process, they might be more invested in it. Also, right now, there's only sort of the one race, right, that we know the final outcome of. And so a lot of attention is focused on that race and the fact that a Democrat got elected. Once you see a ton of Republicans being elected under the vast majority of other elections that are being held, right, again, I think folks might feel differently. And I also think, it's important to keep a broader perspective on what this could do, right? Republicans in Virginia used RCV in their party primary, not a top four system, not open primary, right? Their closed party convention used RCV for selecting their gubernatorial candidate. They used it for additional candidates to produce great candidates, right? And so that have gone on to win. And so in some ways, Republicans in Alaska could look at the CVR data, the cast vote record data, and be gleaning a lot of insights about, okay, how do we go on to win widely, right? Democrats the same. How do we go on to win widely? That's some of the insights that this provides that you wouldn't have sort of in a traditional single choice election.
And there are some questions in the Q&A about the prospects for using ranked choice voting in partisan primaries as a sort of alternative model. And let me ask Lisa if she's willing to share a little bit more of your thoughts about, these alternatives. And based on what you've seen in Alaska, Lisa, do you have a sense that there is something that is in fact preferable?
Well, I think, to answer that question, as well as to sort of respond to the question about voter trust in the process, my understanding is that trying to predict exactly how a ranked choice voting system, what the outcomes will be like going forward, that's very hard to do. So you have, major disagreements over, for example, how ranked choice voting will interact with racially polarized voting. You have disagreements with respect to, what it might do to this political party in that context, or that political party in that context, what it will do, whether it's likely to elevate moderate candidates, or whether it's likely to elevate extremist candidates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one way to improve sort of voter trust in the process is to have more ranked choice voting, insofar as that then presumably people will see that the outcomes aren't following a consistent pattern that maybe they thought they would be following. That being said, there's some work by Jack Santucci at Drexel came out with something recently where he talks about there is this pattern in the United States of ranked choice voting becoming adopted, being used for relatively short periods of time, and then being repealed. So to the extent we see that now, it does, at least in his argument, it fits into this historical pattern of dissatisfaction with the current system, producing these kind of unstable coalitions of people desiring ranked choice voting, which then after maybe a cycle or two becomes repealed. So, we'll see if that plays out again here.
Well, we are coming up against our 60 minutes of discussion time. Let me thank all four of you, Michael, James, Benjamin, and Lisa. We really appreciate you spending this time with us. And thanks also to Jillian Thompson, who's coordinated many of the logistics and did her best to keep me in line. And I'm really sorry that I had the difficulty I did sharing some slides today. But we appreciate this opportunity to have these conversations, and we very much desire to continue doing this and look forward to future opportunities as we explore ways to continue to make our democracy function more effectively in doing what we want it to do. So thank you all. Thanks to the audience, and stay well. Take care.